there is a truth so profound, so quietly disruptive, that once you truly see it, you will never look at reality the same way again. Not because something changed out there, but because something shifted in the way you perceive. Most people move through life assuming that the world around them is solid, fixed, already decided, as if reality simply exists, waiting to be interpreted. But what if that's not true? What if nothing around you is actually real, until the moment you observe it as real? At first, this might sound abstract, almost philosophical, maybe even symbolic, but it isn't. This idea is rooted in one of the most well-known experiments in quantum physics, the double-slit experiment. When subatomic particles are not being observed, they don't behave like solid objects. They exist as possibilities, as waves, spread across multiple potential states at once. But the moment an observer enters the equation, something changes. The wave collapses. Possibility becomes form. And what was once potential becomes reality. The act of observation alters the outcome. Now pause for a moment and consider what this actually means. If, at the most fundamental level of existence, reality only becomes defined when it is observed, then you are not just living inside the world. You are participating in how it becomes real. You are not simply someone going through an experience. You are the point where possibilities collapse into form. And maybe what you've been calling life is not something that is happening to you, but something that is happening through you. And if that's true, then the question changes completely. It's no longer, what is happening to me? But instead, what am I observing that is making this real? And this is where most people unknowingly trap themselves. Because even after hearing something like this, they continue to live as if reality is already decided. They wake up each day and step back into the same patterns, the same thoughts, the same emotional reactions, the same interpretations of what is happening. Not because they want to stay stuck, but because they don't realize what they are reinforcing. They believe they are responding to reality, when in fact, they are recreating it. Every time you focus on what isn't working, you strengthen it. Every time you emotionally react to the same limitation, you give it more solidity. Every time you revisit the same internal narrative, you observe it again. And each observation deepens its presence. This is the loop, not a loop of circumstances, but a loop of observation. You look at what is, you react to it, and through that reaction, you observe it again. Same input, same emotional engagement, same outcome, over and over. And the most deceptive part is this: it feels real. It feels like you're dealing with facts, with conditions, with a world that exists independently of you. But what if those facts are simply the result of what you've been consistently observing? What if the reason nothing changes is not because change is difficult, but because your attention has been loyal to the same version of reality? This is not about blame, and it's not about forcing positivity. It's about awareness, because once you see this, you begin to understand something crucial. You are not stuck in your life. You are stuck in a pattern of observation that keeps recreating the same life. And if observation is what sustains it, then changing reality doesn't begin with action. It begins with what you choose to see. So what happens if you stop observing your life the same way? Not by ignoring reality, but by changing the lens through which you see it. What if, instead of constantly focusing on what is missing, you began to notice what is possible? What if, instead of reacting to the past, you started responding to a future that hasn't fully taken shape yet? This is where everything begins to shift, because the moment your observation becomes intentional, your reality stops being something you react to and starts becoming something you influence. Most people are unconsciously observing from habit, from memory, from conditioning, from emotional patterns they've repeated so many times. They feel automatic. But observation doesn't have to be automatic. It can be chosen. You can decide where your attention goes. You can decide what you give meaning to. You can decide which version of reality you emotionally engage with. And that decision is where change begins. This is what people refer to as quantum manifestation. Not as a mystical idea, but as a shift in how observation is used. Because reality is not something that happens to you. It happens through you, through your attention, through your interpretation, through the emotional energy you attach to what you see. And when you begin to observe with intention, something subtle starts to reorganize. You are no longer reinforcing what already exists. You are beginning to give energy to what could exist. And that difference is everything. If reality is shaped through observation, then the next question becomes inevitable. What exactly is responding? What is it that reorganizes when you shift your attention? This is where the concept of the quantum field comes in, not as something abstract, but as the underlying layer of reality itself. An invisible field, composed of energy, frequency, and potential. A field where everything exists, not as fixed outcomes, but as possibilities. Possibilities waiting, not to be forced into existence, but to be observed into form. And here's where most people misunderstand the process. They think the field responds to what they say they want, but it doesn't. It responds to what they consistently observe with attention, emotion, and coherence. Because the field is not listening for words, it is responding to frequency, and your attention is what directs that frequency. Think of your focus like a flashlight. Wherever you point it, you illuminate one version of reality over another. Not because you're creating something from nothing, but because you are selecting from what already exists as potential. So the real question is not, what do I want? But, where is my attention actually resting, moment after moment? Because if your attention is anchored in fear, the field reflects that. If it's anchored in doubt, it reflects that. If it's anchored in scarcity, it organizes around that. But if your attention begins to stabilize in trust, in clarity, in possibility, the field responds differently. Not because you asked for something new, but because you are observing from a different state. And that state is what determines what becomes real. Once you understand that the field responds to observation, another layer becomes clear. Observation is not passive, it is energetic. Every time you focus on a thought and emotionally engage with it, you are not just noticing it, you are feeding it, you are giving it energy, and wherever energy goes, form begins to follow. This is why the same patterns repeat, not because reality is fixed, but because attention is. The same thoughts generate the same emotions reinforce the same interpretations, and those interpretations lead to the same outcomes, again and again and again. Not by force, but by reinforcement. Because energy follows awareness. Where your attention lingers, your energy accumulates. And where energy accumulates, reality begins to organize. So when you repeatedly focus on what isn't working, you are not just observing a problem, you are stabilizing it. You are strengthening its presence in your experience. But the same principle works in the opposite direction. Every time you bring your attention to a higher possibility, even if it hasn't happened yet, and you allow yourself to feel into it, you begin something subtle. You begin the process of collapse. You start giving energy to a different version of reality, not through effort, not through force, but through sustained awareness. This is why struggle doesn't create change, and why willpower alone often fails. Because reality is not responding to how hard you try. It is responding to the state from which you observe, and that means something important. You don't have to push your way into a new life. You have to become the observer who is already aligned with it. Up to this point, you might still be interpreting everything in a familiar way, as if your inner state is just a response to what is happening outside. But this is where the perspective completely flips. Because what if it's the other way around? What if your inner state is not reacting to reality, but generating it? This is the inversion that thinkers like Joe Dispenza, Amit Goswami, and Bob Proctor have spent decades pointing toward. The idea that consciousness is primary and matter is secondary. That what you see in the physical world is not the cause, but the result. Not the origin, but the expression. If that's true, then your attention is not just noticing reality, it is shaping it. Your intention begins to organize possibilities. Your awareness begins to give them direction, and what you consistently observe begins to take form. The field itself is neutral. It doesn't decide what should happen. It doesn't evaluate what is better or worse. It simply responds to the signal it receives. And that signal is your state of consciousness. Your attention provides the direction. Your emotion provides the charge. Your coherence stabilizes the pattern. Together, they form a kind of internal blueprint, and that blueprint is what reality starts to follow. This is where spiritual language and scientific observation begin to overlap, not as belief, but as a model of how reality behaves. Because when mind and emotion align, when thought and feeling move in the same direction, something becomes consistent, and consistency is what allows potential to become form. At this stage, many people believe they understand the idea. They start thinking differently. They try to focus on better outcomes. They even visualize a different life. And yet, nothing seems to change. Why? Because understanding is not enough, and intention alone is not enough. What actually creates change is coherence. Coherence between what you think, what you feel, and who you are being. Most people think one thing, but feel another. They visualize abundance, but emotionally remain in scarcity. They imagine love, but carry a constant fear of rejection. They say they want change, but internally stay identified with the past. And the field does not respond to what you say. It responds to what is consistent, because inconsistency creates noise, and noise does not collapse reality. Only coherence does. When your mind moves in one direction, and your emotional state supports it, something stabilizes. Your signal becomes clear. Your observation becomes precise, and that precision is what allows a new pattern to form. This is why techniques often fail, not because they don't work, but because the person using them is divided, split between what they want and what they feel is true. But when thought and emotion align, when intention and identity match, you stop trying to create change, and you start becoming the version of you that already reflects it. And from that state, reality doesn't need to be forced. It begins to reorganize. At this point, something even more important becomes clear. Your attention is not just influencing reality, it is sustaining it. Because attention is not passive, it is magnetic. Wherever your awareness goes, your energy gathers. And wherever energy gathers, patterns begin to stabilize. This is why your life often feels repetitive. Not because you are stuck in circumstances, but because you are consistent in attention. The same thoughts create the same emotional responses. Those emotions guide the same decisions. Those decisions reinforce the same experiences. And those experiences confirm the same thoughts. A closed loop, self-reinforcing, self-sustaining. Not because it has to be that way, but because it is being observed that way. Your thoughts are not just describing your life. They are activating matching timelines. Every time you focus on something, and emotionally engage with it. You are selecting a version of reality and giving it weight. This is why the field doesn't need to judge. It doesn't need to decide what you deserve. It simply reflects what you reinforce. So when your attention stays anchored in what is missing, in what is not working, in what feels limited, you are not just noticing those patterns, you are stabilizing them. But the moment your attention shifts, even slightly, toward a different possibility, and you allow that possibility to feel real within you, something begins to change. You start interrupting the loop. You stop feeding the same pattern and begin giving energy to a different one. And that shift is where new realities begin. So how do you actually step out of that loop? Not by fighting your current reality, not by denying what exists, but by changing what you continue to observe. Because as long as your attention is locked onto what is, you remain tied to it. You keep reinforcing the same structure, the same identity, the same outcomes. The shift begins when you stop giving your full attention to what already exists and start directing it toward what doesn't exist yet. Not as fantasy, not as escape, but as a deliberate act of observation. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They think they are pretending. They think they are forcing themselves to believe something unreal. But that's not what's happening. You are not faking reality. You are selecting a different one before it becomes visible. You are choosing to observe a possibility and holding your attention there long enough for it to begin stabilizing. Because every reality starts as potential, and potential only becomes form when it is consistently observed. This is what it truly means to shift your state. Not to ignore what is happening, but to stop making it your primary reference point. Instead of asking, "What is happening right now?" you begin asking, "What am I choosing to observe as real?" And that choice redefines everything. Because the moment your attention becomes intentional, you stop being someone who reacts to reality, and you start becoming someone who selects it. Block 9. At a certain point, this stops being about thoughts, and it becomes about identity. Because the way you observe reality is not random. It comes from who you believe you are. Your current identity is constantly scanning the world for confirmation. It looks for evidence. It checks what's working. It measures progress. It validates fears. It is rooted in what has already happened, and because of that, it keeps observing the same patterns over and over again. But there is another way of observing, not from the past, but from possibility, not from reaction, but from direction. This is what we can call the quantum self, the version of you that does not need external proof to begin aligning internally. The version of you that understands, reality does not need to confirm who I am. I confirm it first. This is where the real shift happens. When you stop asking the world to show you something different before you allow yourself to feel different, and instead, you begin stabilizing a new internal state without immediate evidence. You hold a different vision. You sustain a different emotional baseline. You observe from a different perspective, and over time, that internal state stops feeling unfamiliar. It becomes natural. It becomes your new identity, and once identity shifts, observation changes automatically. And once observation changes, reality follows. At this stage, the question becomes unavoidable. What are you consistently observing? Not occasionally, not when you're trying to feel better, but throughout your day, in your automatic thoughts, in your emotional reactions, in the way you interpret what happens. Because that is what's shaping your reality. Most people believe change happens in isolated moments, during reflection, during intention, during visualization. But reality is not built in isolated moments. It is built in your baseline, in what you repeatedly return to when no one is watching. That is your signal. That is your frequency. And that is what the field responds to. So the shift here is not about effort. It's about awareness. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What am I reinforcing?" without realizing it. Not from guilt, not from blame, but from clarity. Because once you see what you're reinforcing, you gain the ability to change it. This is where you stop trying to control reality and start taking responsibility for your state. And that responsibility is not a burden, it's leverage. Because the moment you recognize that your observation is shaping your experience, you stop being a victim of patterns, and you become the one who can interrupt them. At some point, people start to wonder, why does this keep happening to me? As if there's something evaluating them, testing them, holding things back. But the field doesn't work that way. It doesn't judge, it doesn't reward, it doesn't punish, it doesn't check your past, it doesn't measure your worth. It simply reflects. Precisely, consistently, without interpretation. Whatever you are being, it mirrors. Not what you say you want, not what you occasionally think about, but what you consistently observe and emotionally reinforce. This is why there is often a gap between intention and experience. You might be visualizing abundance while still feeling scarcity. You might be affirming love while carrying fear. You might be thinking about freedom while emotionally anchored in control or doubt. And the field does not try to reconcile that contradiction. It reflects the stronger signal, the more consistent one, not because it's choosing, but because that's how it functions. It mirrors frequency. So when things don't seem to align, it's not because something is being withheld, it's because something is not matching, not at the level of words, but at the level of state. And once you understand that, you stop trying to convince reality, and you start aligning with it. This is where most teachings get misunderstood, because people believe manifestation is about getting what they want. But it isn't. You don't attract what you want, you experience what you are aligned with. And that changes everything, because wanting something does not place you in the same frequency as having it. In fact, wanting often reinforces the absence of it. It keeps your attention anchored in what is missing, and the field responds to that. Not because it misunderstood you, but because it is responding accurately to your state. So the shift is not about asking for more. It's about becoming coherent with what you say you want. Because the version of you that already has what you desire exists, not as imagination, but as a potential state within the field. And the only thing that determines whether you experience it is alignment. If you are aligned with peace, you experience peace. If you are aligned with clarity, you experience clarity. If you are aligned with limitation, you experience limitation, not because of circumstances, but because of frequency. The field cannot deliver one state through the vibration of another. It cannot reflect abundance through the energy of lack. It cannot stabilize confidence through the presence of doubt, not because you are unworthy, but because the signal doesn't match. So the question becomes, are you trying to get something, or are you becoming someone who already reflects it? Because only one of those creates change. So what do you actually do with all of this? Not in theory, but in your daily life. The answer is simpler than most expect, but it requires consistency. You begin by observing yourself, not trying to immediately change everything, but becoming aware of what is already happening within you. Your thoughts, your emotional patterns, your default reactions, because before you can shift your reality, you need to see what you are currently reinforcing. Most people only pay attention to how they feel in specific moments, when something goes wrong, when something triggers them, when they are trying to do the work. But your reality is not shaped in isolated moments. It is shaped by your baseline, the emotional state you return to again and again and again. That baseline is your signal. So the practice becomes this. You start noticing your thoughts without immediately believing them. You begin to feel your emotional state without automatically reacting to it. You create space between observation and identification, and in that space, you gain choice. You are no longer pulled by every thought. You are no longer defined by every feeling. You begin to recognize patterns without reinforcing them. And slowly, your baseline starts to shift, not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding what no longer serves you and started returning to what you want to stabilize, again and again, until it becomes familiar. And what is familiar eventually becomes natural, and what is natural becomes your reality. Now everything becomes immediate, not theoretical, not distant, but present. Because if your attention is shaping your reality, then something is already being reinforced right now. So the real question is, what are you stabilizing? What are you observing again and again with emotional engagement? Is it the version of your life that feels limited? The patterns that feel familiar? The narratives that repeat themselves without you even noticing? Or are you beginning to place your attention somewhere else? Because the field does not wait for the right moment. It responds continuously to what you focus on, to what you feel into, to what you return to, by default. This is why many people try to change their lives, but remain in the same results. They attempt to shift the reflection without ever changing what they are projecting. They want different outcomes, but keep observing from the same identity, and the field faithfully reflects that. Not because it is resisting you, but because it is precise. So this becomes a moment of decision. Not about forcing change, but about choosing direction. You begin to withdraw your attention from what you no longer want to sustain, not by fighting it, but by no longer feeding it. And you start placing your awareness on what you want to become real, with presence, with consistency, with emotional engagement. Because what you repeatedly observe, you eventually stabilize. And what you stabilize becomes your experience. At any given moment, there isn't just one version of your life unfolding. There are many, different timelines, different possibilities, different versions of you, already existing within the field. Not as imagination, but as potential. Right now, there is a version of you still repeating the same emotional loops, still validating the same limitations, still observing the same patterns that have been there for years. And at the very same time, there is another version of you, a version that has already shifted, more clear, more grounded, more aligned. A version of you that is no longer defined by those same patterns. Both exist, both are available, but only one becomes your experience. And the difference is not effort, it is observation. The timeline you emotionally engage with, the one you return to, the one you give your attention to, is the one that begins to solidify. This is what people often misunderstand. They think change happens when something external shifts first. But in this model, change happens when you begin to observe a different version of yourself, before there is evidence. Not as denial, but as selection. You are not pretending. You are choosing which version of reality you are willing to stabilize. And the more consistently you hold your attention there, the less distance exists between that version and your current experience. Until eventually, there is no separation at all. There is a point where all of this becomes quieter, less effort, less intensity, less trying, and more presence. This is the state of the silent observer, not someone who is passive, but someone who is no longer entangled, no longer reacting to every fluctuation, no longer chasing outcomes, no longer arguing with what is. Because they understand something deeper. Reality does not reorganize through force. It reorganizes through clarity. In this state, you are not trying to manifest anything. You are observing with certainty. You are not pushing against the present moment. You are seeing beyond it, not with denial, but with stability, because in the quantum field, everything exists as potential, and potential does not collapse because you struggle. It collapses when you observe with coherence, with stillness, with precision, with a clear internal state. This is why many people try so hard and feel like nothing moves, because they are still observing through resistance, still focusing more on what is wrong than on what is possible. But the silent observer does not react to appearances. It does not rush to interpret. It does not need immediate proof. It simply holds a clear internal signal and allows reality to respond. There is no urgency, no pressure, only alignment. And from that alignment, something begins to shift. Not because you forced it, but because you became coherent enough for a new pattern to stabilize. At some point, quietly, almost without noticing, you begin to realize something. The universe isn't testing you. It isn't holding anything back. It isn't waiting for you to prove yourself. It's responding, constantly, precisely, without interpretation. Not to what you say you want, but to what you consistently are, to what you observe, to what you feel, to the state you return to again and again. And when you truly see that, everything changes. Because the moment you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I stabilizing through my attention?" you reclaim something, not control line, but authorship. You stop trying to fix the reflection, and you begin to shift what is being reflected. And from there, a different kind of life becomes possible, not because you forced it into existence, but because you became aligned with a different version of it. So maybe the real shift is this: you don't need more effort. You don't need more strategies. You don't need to chase a different outcome. You need to see what you've been consistently observing and decide if that's the reality you want to keep making real. Because in a field that responds to observation, the most powerful thing you can do is choose what you are willing to see before it becomes visible, and then stay with it long enough for reality to follow.